Hello and welcome to World History Week 4. Already more than a month into this fun madness here. 3 lessons this week as we get deeper into the Renaissance and see some reactions to this new way of thinking that kind of push back against it a little bit in some respects. We're going to be starting off in Europe today, and particularly in Florence, where we've heard about the de' Medici family, and they're helping to usher in the Renaissance and all this new way of doing art, new way of thinking, new way of regarding man's role in the world. And we're getting to some of the clashes this week between this new sort of humanist way of thinking, where man is at the center of thoughts, and religious forms of thinking, where God is at the center of thoughts. There is an inevitable conflict sometimes that can come from these two very different approaches. Gentlemen, we're going to talk about to start today off is Girolamo Savonarola. Yeah, that's the name. He was born to a noble family in the 15th century in Florence. Even as a young boy, he was very studious, very serious, very much interested in following rules, very devout in church. He accepted Christ at a very early age. He was very, very mature from the get-go. He was clearly very, very different. Again, as he's coming of age, Cosimo de' Medici, the first of the de' Medici family to really embrace these new ways of thinking, was in power in Florence. Again, Italy was governed in a city-state system. There was no Italy as we know it today. It was just a region of a lot of city-states. And Cosimo de' Medici, of course, looked back to the ancient Greek and Roman empires to gain modern-day inspiration. As this happened, the people who were beginning to look into these cultures were also adopting some of the traits of these cultures that some say led to their downfall. That is to say, immorality, excessive luxury, and too much of a focus on self and self-gratification. And Savonarola did not like what he saw. He was eager to straighten out society, but he was first interested in straightening out the church. He said the Catholic Church, Christian Church, had grown terribly rich and terribly immoral, and he was not wrong. At the time, the Pope that was governing this time, whom we'll talk more about later, was very, very much a man of the world and not necessarily of the cloth. Savonarola joined the Dominican friars when he was only 23 years old, and he discovered he had a talent for communication, and that developed into a talent for preaching. And he went back to Florence to preach at the behest of the monastery, and at first he flopped. He just could not connect with people. His sermons just fell flat. And it was probably because Savonarola was preaching over their heads. He was acting like he was talking to fellow religious scholars, and so he just never made that connection with people. And so at the age of 38, after trying this for really more than 10 years, he decided this was not for him, and he went back to the monastery. He worked around in the monastery some more and felt the call to preach again. You got to be pretty persistent to try something for 10 years, fail at it, and then feel like this time it will work. So give Savonarola points for being persistent. This time, for whatever reason, the people were very receptive to his message. Now, what happened between now and then, only God knows that. But for whatever reason, his second round of preaching in Florence began attracting a lot of attention. The cathedral at which he preached was routinely packed, and his followers were evidently so moved by his sermons they came to be called the Weepers for all the tears they shed. So very emotional sermons, evidently. From what we know, Savonarola preached a very straightforward truth about Jesus and how Jesus should be the center of one's life. His greatest emphasis was on personal holiness. Again, developing that direct relationship with Jesus Christ. He also put in a fair amount of fire and brimstone into his sermons. He said we should fear the judgment of God that was to come. He said, quote, "You Christians should always have the gospel with you, and I don't mean the book, but the Spirit. For if you do not possess the Spirit of grace and yet carry with you the whole book, of what advantage is it to you?" He urged people specifically to get rid of worldly things and to be more like Jesus. The worldly things of the time, of course, gambling, cursing, cards, dice, alcohol. He opposed the traveling carnivals that came around because he likened it to pagan practices. He frowned even on makeup or excessive jewelry and any clothing that he deemed immodest. He was very serious about living a very Spartan personal lifestyle, so you're less of the world and more attuned to God, at least in the way he sees God. And it struck a chord with people. Evidently, again, the Renaissance art and all that followed it, the way of thinking, was popular, becoming more popular amongst the upper class, but for the lower class, it was seen as highfalutin, self-indulgent, and for those who were devoutly religious, sort of the opposite of God. So, again, while we sort of embrace Renaissance-type thought, for many at the time, particularly the rank-and-file citizens, it was seen as immoral. And the poor people loved Savonarola because he fussed so much at the rich people. Famous artists like Botticelli and Michelangelo began changing the themes of their artworks to better glorify God. And yes, after Savonarola began really picking up steam in Florence, he had an impact on the art. You see the paintings of Botticelli after a certain point in life. Botticelli, whom we talked about last week, I think, maybe the week before, painted only religious paintings, only depictions. Michelangelo, of course, I mean, we'll learn more about him in particular next week. After being exposed to the preaching of Savonarola, he started focusing almost exclusively on religious themes. Now, it's good that a lot of people are paying attention to someone preaching the gospel, but as with most everything else, when we get too much into it, then we tend to do things to the extreme. And there developed a very strong group of extremists who were adopting Savonarola's ethos. They began to be known as bands of hope, but many people began referring to them as the moral police, demanding that people give up items, personal items, of vanity, things, worldly items, to be burned in bonfires. Neighbors began spying on neighbors to report them for playing cards or for cursing. So this zeal for holiness quickly gave way to fear and intimidation. And sometimes, far too often, quite frankly, people use religion to coerce, and you can take anything to the extreme. And the more to the extreme they took this, the less like Jesus they were. Jesus never forced anybody under threat of coercion to turn over their stuff. In time, Savonarola will realize this, but not until it was too late. Remember, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about Cosimo de' Medici's grandson, Lorenzo, who was really, really into the Renaissance art and the lifestyle, and sort of let other people govern. He was more of a kind of a playboy. Naturally, he was fond of all the arts and carnivals and things that Savonarola did not like. He tried to bribe Savonarola, did Lorenzo, with gifts of gold, but Savonarola was not interested in that. The masses, though, soon overthrew Lorenzo's son after Lorenzo died and his son took over. And they turned their eyes to Savonarola to rule and govern France, to Florence, that is. And Savonarola accepted it, and he took his role very seriously. He put together a council of men to help him govern Florence, and he began to imagine a city-state with Christ as its head, a little slice of heaven on earth, if you will. Well, this vision, while certainly grounded in good intentions, had lots of problems. You see, the problem is Christ never taught that his kingdom should be established on earth. Yes, we are to follow his teachings and try to be more like him at all times, but nowhere does Jesus say we should set up a government to force people to live the way that we think they ought to live. Savonarola, though, believed that he was put on this earth then to create a Christian utopia in Florence, Italy. His intentions may have been sincere, but they were not biblically based. There's no biblical basis for God's kingdom on earth other than that which is established by God. His greatest threat, Savonarola's, as it turned out, was the Pope at the time, Alexander VI. He might have been the least holy Pope in history. He fathered 5 children, of course, without being married. He supported the use of murder to get what he wanted. This was not a man of God. Savonarola did not endear himself to Pope Alexander when he wrote, quote, "O prostitute church, thou hast displayed thy foulness to the whole world, and stinkest unto heaven." You can kind of figure what kind of response this was going to get. In 1495, Pope Alexander VI tried to pressure Savonarola to stop preaching. For about a year, Savonarola did listen to the Pope, and he toned things down a bit, but when the next season of Lent came around, he returned to the pulpit and let them have it. He basically told the Pope that he was a bad, evil person, and that he stirred the crowds to, quote, burn their vanities, like we talked about earlier, in a massive bonfire right in the middle of Florence. It drew a great amount of attention. The Pope then tried to bribe Savonarola to pipe down, and Savonarola rejected it, much like he did with Medici's offer of gold. Alexander then decided the only way to shut him up was to excommunicate him. Now, for those of you who were with us last year, you know that popes used excommunication to very great effect. The Pope was seen as God's direct representative on earth, second only to God, really. And when they excommunicated you from the church, we've seen several instances of leaders who then lost all types of whatever moral authority they had to govern people. The people said, well, if the Pope's excommunicating you, there's no way I'm going to listen to what you say. He pleaded with them Savonarola pleaded with leaders in other countries, calling the Pope a devil, trying to get them to take the Pope out of office, but no one was interested in taking up his cause. Eventually, the religious authorities rounded Savonarola up, and I'm not going to go into the method of execution, but let's just say he was tortured and executed in a very, very public manner. He was teaching personal holiness at the height of the Renaissance in an era of humanism, again, where human beings are seen as a bit divine themselves. You're starting to see, again, some of the conflicts that emerge from this new way of thinking, which is very self-focused and focused on gratification, as opposed to religion. Sometimes it's quite incompatible, and the case of Savonarola was one of those instances where those two worlds collided, and there still are many instances, even in today's culture. I think we can all agree we're living in a me-first culture, particularly here in the Western society, where individuals are seen as having certain rights, of course. But God tells us to think not of this world, but think of heaven. He doesn't tell us to ignore this world. So you can see where a very worldly philosophy like the Renaissance thinking and traditional Christian thinking were going to clash. Let's move to the Middle East and modern-day Iran. The land was originally called Elam, the area just east of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, otherwise known as Mesopotamia. Civilizations go back there to at least 2000 BC. You remember the biblical story of Esther and King Xerxes. That was in Persia. Genghis Khan, Alexander the Great ruled Persia at different points. And of course, today it is Iran. It's also been the epicenter of the Great Schism in Islam. The Sunnis and the Shiites, the two major divisions of Islam. Right after Muhammad, the founder of Islam, died, a great debate among his followers sprung up as to who was going to lead the movement in his wake. The Sunnis believed that the next Islamic leader should be Muhammad's best friend, Abu Bakr. When Muhammad died, Abu Bakr claimed to be the next Islamic leader. He claimed to be a caliph, which is the highest Islamic leader in the land. The Shiites, though, as they came to be called, thought that a relative of Muhammad should be his replacement. His closest relative when he died was Ali, the husband of one of Muhammad's daughters. And Ali wanted to be the next caliph. Didn't work out right away, but he waited his turn, and he eventually served as the fourth caliph. After that, the two groups fought bitterly over their differences, and in time, each claimed their own respective leaders. The two groups still have not settled their differences. The division between the Sunnis and the Shiites is still very, very much an issue in the Middle East. It is the difference between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Both of them are, two powerhouse nations in the Islamic world, and they are very different. They are not allies because Iran is Shiite and Saudi is Sunni. You can kind of think about the schism we have in Christianity, which we will talk about a whole lot here in a couple of weeks with Protestant reform and modern-day Catholics and Protestants. They're both are Christian, but they do worshiping and their view of God in some pretty different ways. Now, the Sunni-Shiite chasm is much deeper than Catholics and Protestants today, but you get the idea. Even within a religion, there can be profound disagreement. The idea was, though, in this region, again, modern-day Persia, one reason that Islam easily spread to Persia was that it was and is more than just a religion. Islam is a form of government as well. To oppose it is difficult. To accept it would bring unity and strength to Persia, and so they did. The Shiites won that battle. Their domination officially started in 1501 under the leadership of Ismail I. He was a Sunni, but he was tutored by a Shiite and became a very strong Shiite in his beliefs. And his beliefs shaped what would be called the Safavid Empire, which eventually shaped modern-day Iran, like the way this map describes it here. Shiites view their leaders very differently than Sunnis. Shiites believe that their first 12 leaders, who are called the imams, are almost godlike in themselves. They had supernatural abilities. They believed the first 12 imams were without sin and that they could intervene between Allah and man, Allah, of course, being the God of Islam. Shiites believe the 12th Imam did not completely die and will one day return knowledge and give direction to the Shiites. The Sunnis, while still Islamic, do not have that view of their leaders. When Ismail was only 13, he decided, he was very ambitious, he wanted to not be the leader of a religious order, he wanted to be the king of an empire. He claimed himself to be the Shah, which means king, and he named his empire Safavid after one of his ancestors. Ishmael believed he was supposed to be the highest spiritual and political leader of the land. With the spiritual king, the Safavid Empire was, in every definition, a theocracy. That's where government is completely based on religion. The courts of the land run by religious men called clerics of Islam. Right now, to this day, Iran is almost 90% Shiite, 10% Sunni. Iran is the only country in the world that is a theocracy based on the Shiite faith. We've talked in the past and will continue to talk about the problems where in Christianity, for example, you marry the cross and the crown. Bad things usually happen from that. In Islam, though, the belief is that it is perfectly acceptable and even encouraged for your governance to be religiously based. There is no separation of church and state in the Islam religion. Now, the problem, of course, is when you have a theocracy and you don't necessarily follow the religious lead of the government, bad things happen to you. And it happened in the Safavid Empire. Many Sunnis were still in Persia when Ismail took over. Some were killed. Some were forced to convert to Shiism. Ismail was harsh. He proved to be a very capable military leader, strong spiritual leader. His warriors wore red hats to show their loyalty to him. The legend around Ismail was that he was so confident of his winning, he did not wear armor in battle. He expanded the borders of Persia to include most of Mesopotamia. He made Tabriz the capital of Persia. The enemies were mainly to the west, the Ottoman Turks. And in a more than symbolic victory, he captured the city of Baghdad, which is, of course, in modern-day Iraq. The Ottoman Turks were his enemies because they were mainly Sunnis, and the Uzbek to the northeast were also mainly Sunnis. So the Shiites were beginning to take over Islam with the leadership of Ismail. As we've seen with history, the problem with great leaders is sometimes their sons and grandsons are not as capable, and that was the case with Ismail. The Ottomans eventually took back Baghdad, and there was a whole lot of property loss during the reign of Ismail's sons and grandsons. But along came a pretty remarkable leader named Abbas, who came to power in the year 1587 when he was only 17 years old. He's called Abbas the Great, and he was certainly great at conquering. He moved the city from Tabriz to Isfahan, and he adorned it with great architecture, magnificent palaces. The making of Persian rugs began in earnest here, and they were of such fine quality that he was willing to open trade with so-called infidel Europeans because they were very, very interested in getting their hands on these incredible Persian tapestries. And, of course, Persian rugs are still very much prized even today. Abbas, again good with the sword as well, he took Baghdad back in the year 1603, and by the year 1629 he had returned the borders of the Safavid Empire, Persia, back to where Ismail had pushed them. Every man has a flaw, and Abbas had plenty of them. He was very paranoid and insecure. He had his eldest son killed and left his other sons to be raised in a harem, thinking that they were going to go after him, like he had gone after his father. The Safavid Empire did not last as long as others. By the year 1722, the Persians were overrun by several enemies, but nonetheless, the Shiite Empire in its glory helped shape the future of Iran and is still playing a major role in Iranian politics and Middle Eastern politics. Again, history is not was, history is. Last week there were demonstrations that broke out across Iran after the so-called morality police, have we heard that term before today, attacked and killed a woman for not wearing a hijab, the head covering. And the reason that this is a sin in Iran is because it is a theocracy. It is ruled by religious order, and people are rebelling against it. They've been rebelling against it for some time, but they just have not been able to oust it. But again, these old Shiite customs, again, marrying the state and the religion, is still a point of contention in the world today. History is not was, history is. Final lesson today is on a person that I simply think is the most remarkable human that we know about. That's a pretty remarkable statement. again, there have been, of course, billions of people that have lived and died, and we know nothing of them. But of those that we know something about, I can't think of anyone more impressive than Leonardo da Vinci. And the thing most impressive about him was his versatility and his expertise in such a vast number of subjects. It is amazing. He was born in 1452 in a small village near Vinci, Italy. Thus his name, Da Vinci. And he grew up in a very poor home, but Leonardo, it was obvious early on that this kid had a lot on the ball intellectually. He was just sharp as a tack. In school, he excelled in math and music, which in terms of the brain are two very different parts of the brain that govern math and music, and he excelled at both of them. He began drawing anything he could with great detail. He was almost scatterbrained. He would be in the middle of a project and then think about something else and start drawing it down. Kind of an OCD, maybe even a form of autism, we don't know. But the guy was just brilliant at everything. His father noticed this talent in his kid and moved to Florence. And of course, this was at the time the Medicis were really bringing in the Renaissance. Lorenzo de' Medici was only 3 years older than Leonardo. He was in power at the time. Leonardo first started off as an apprentice to a master goldsmith, painter, and sculptor. This apprenticeship lasted 13 years. All throughout this time, while learning trades, Leonardo just wrote and evidently thought without ceasing. He began focusing on painting, and something peculiar began to work into his mind. He began a scene titled The Adoration of the Magi, where he experimented with breaking the rules of perspective. Perspective is the art of making objects appear in their actual size. He drew stairs that led to nowhere, horses that were larger than life, the mother of Jesus, Mary, as if she were suspended in time and looking down in awe upon her son. She seems unaware of the chaos. From a perspective standpoint, he played around with it, and the images were striking. According to Leonardo, he liked to use what he called, quote, abundance and variety. He continued to make that one of his distinguishing traits in his art. Even in his serious portraits of his patrons, people who hired him to do portraits, he always added real and imaginary landscapes to the background. He was never content with just painting the person. It had to be something special. The Adoration of the Magi is a work he never finished, and that was not unusual for Leonardo. He would work on stuff for years. Some of his great works of art were actually developed over many years. He would back away from a project and then years later get an idea and go back to it and add on to it. And to his way of thinking, at least, he never finished the Adoration of the Magi. He was a perfectionist. He was a perfectionist, and he was easily distracted by other things. I mean, it was just amazing to think about how that mind worked. He, over the course of his lifetime, and thank God we found him, Leonardo wrote at least 7,000 pages of notebooks, of drawings, sketches, notes, thoughts. One of the remarkable things, just to kind of give you a little peek inside of his brain, the notes are written backwards, from right to left. Now, the reason he did that might have been a simple, the simple explanation might be he was left-handed. And, of course, you're using quill and ink then, and when you're left-handed and you're using quill and ink to write from left to right, your hand goes over the parts you just wrote over and can smudge very easily. So, being left-handed, he just wrote the opposite way. Everything is like a photo negative. It's wild. The thing that strikes you when you take a look at his notes and the totality is just the endless variety of subjects that he took on. And he nailed it. So much of what he wrote was the theoretical background for inventions that happened centuries after he was alive. it is astounding to think of what passed through that mind, and thank God he put it on paper, because again, it was the intellectual foundation for some of the just most incredible advancements in human history. And this left-handed Italian back in the 15th and 16th centuries was just jotting those ideas down as quickly as they came to his mind. He wrote about weapons, geometry, machines, the movement of water, the anatomy of the human body. He illustrated levers, cameras, parachutes, bicycles, flying devices, water canals, crossbows, even flying saucers and helicopters, which he called air screws. And again, his drawings were the intellectual and physic foundation for the invention of a helicopter hundreds of years later. He also conceived of the idea of cars and tanks and two-tiered cities. He envisioned machine guns, mechanical chariots, and water mechanisms to prevent floods. He was also, in addition to all this, he was fascinated with plants, architecture, rock formations, and even deformities. He, much to the church's chagrin, would help others cut open dead bodies, not alive bodies, but dead bodies, and draw what was inside. Of course, the church had very superstitious beliefs about the body, the human body, even after death. But it's only by opening the body up and seeing what's in there that you could learn about it, right? And for centuries, the church frowned on this, but people like Leonardo da Vinci were writing this down and forming, again, the theoretical foundation for advancements in medicine that they could only have dreamed about at that point in history. We'll talk about a couple of his paintings. Again, in the end, Da Vinci was most noted as a painter. And of course, two masterpieces that stand out that have just come to really almost serve as the definition of Western civilization. One thing, before we get into that, he worked on a 26-foot bronze statue of a horse and spent over 10 years crafting the clay model for it. People flocked to see it. Unfortunately, enemy soldiers in an invasion of Florence destroyed the horse in 1499 and melted it down. Again, as victors will do, they'll take great pieces of art and leave it and raise it just as a psychological warfare. One of his lesser-known pieces of art that is still talked about today is the Virgin of the Rocks. It's a painting that it took him 20 years to complete. It features just delicate smiles, tender lighting, lots of detail in the background. Again, there was realism, but there was also that perspective that he liked to play with. He broke the rules of perspective again in probably his second most famous painting, The Last Supper. He positioned Jesus' disciples in groups of three. The idea behind the painting was to capture an image of the disciples gathered with Jesus in a room the night before he was crucified, and to get their reaction to him revealing that one of them was a traitor. And you see the reaction of all 12 of the disciples. Of course, it would be unnatural for all 12 of them to be on the same side of the table, but again, for perspective's sake, you got to have that. Seeing the backs of their heads might not have been as striking. The story is told that Leonardo sorted through the faces of countless citizens of Milan for just the proper models to use for the Last Supper. The look on Jesus' face in Da Vinci's painting is probably the image of Jesus that we are most familiar with. He appears to be accepting his coming fate. And the background, of course, beyond Jesus' head is unmistakably the work of Da Vinci. It's filled with lots of details to mystify the viewer. It is a true masterpiece. Probably even more famous than The Last Supper is the Mona Lisa. He painted this after he returned briefly to Florence, and he named it after a friend of his wife, who had just lost her child in childbirth. There's so much to say about the Mona Lisa. The very name Mona Lisa has become synonymous with someone's masterpiece. If someone says, "This is my Mona Lisa," they're saying, "This is my greatest work of art ever." The skin of the Mona Lisa, the subject of the painting, almost radiates almost three-dimensionally. The background is filled with more of Da Vinci's, quote, abundance and variety of natural structures. Again, it's not just a still painting of someone, it's something that is alive. Leonardo kept this painting in his possession for many years. Every once in a while he would add a layer of paint here, a little more depth there, a little less depth. He called the model back several times to pose, and of course, knowing that she had lost her baby before the original of this lends a whole lot of perspective to that enigmatic smile that she's making, capturing the broken heart of a mother in mourning who's still trying to put up a brave face. Today, the Mona Lisa hangs in the Louvre, one of the most famous art museums in the world in Paris. Leonardo rounded out his life 17 years with a patron of the Duke of Milan. He spent his actual last years in Rome. The Pope had invited him to live there and to help beautify the Church of St. Peter and other buildings in the Vatican. His rival Michelangelo joined him later to do that painting project that we'll talk about next week at the Sistine Chapel. The King of France eventually invited Leonardo to live his final years there. He was hired as a painter, an engineer, an architect, and a mechanic for France, and he died in France at the age of 67 in the year 1519. Being a genius does not make one perfect. Leonardo was arrested for crimes of a, so let's just say, a highly personal nature. No one was killed, but he was very flamboyant. Let's just put it that way. In many ways, his lifestyle might have fallen well short of a Christian model, but that's a true example of a Renaissance man, or a man in particular, or a woman. We're not perfect. None of us are. Leonardo da Vinci was simply the most remarkable human being in history, and to me, he is the Renaissance. We'll talk more about him and the rest of the stuff on Monday. See you then.